Good evening, Christian. Good evening to our valued listeners. Again, it's Chido and Christian. We're having the session on the Africa We Want, an African iShare podcast where we discuss matters that are pertinent to the African continent, trying to come up with solutions on how best we can make the continent great again. So today's episode is going to be focusing on Africa's negotiations of trade agreement, the case in point being the Kenya-US Free Trade Agreement that is currently being negotiated. So before I give it to Christine to introduce herself and maybe say about the Kenya-US FTA, I just want to congratulate Nigeria and my fellow brothers from Nigeria for ratifying their signature on the African Continental Free Trade Area, which they did yesterday. I think it's a progressive step given that the deadline for ratification is on the 5th of December, and also that when we open 2021, we expect and hope to have the ball rolling. So over to you, Christian.
Thanks, Chido. And hi, everyone. My name is Christine, and I am an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today about the Kenya and US negotiations for a free trade area.
I just wanted to probably hear from you the background. What do you understand by the Kenya-US Free Trade Agreement? What is it all about? This is for the benefit of our listeners who have no idea of what we're talking about. So basically, what it's about, the main highlights from the negotiations, the benefits for the people of Kenya. How do you see it? How do you view it as a Kenyan?
Okay, so the negotiations between the US and Kenya, since Trump got into office, that's when there started to be a bit of conversation about having a free trade agreement with Kenya. And it was in February 2020 that the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, went to Washington and had a chat with Trump, and they actually put it down that the negotiation for the free trade agreement is now officially underway, and they're actually negotiating for it. So first, from the free trade area agreement, what it will really look like, it will be, the basis is the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and Article 24 of the GATT, which allows countries within WTO, which both Kenya and the US are part of, to negotiate for terms where they can have liberalized trade, where they can take out as much tariffs to trade amongst themselves. So the free trade area, what that the US and Kenya intend to have, the goal is to have such reduced or to completely eliminate tariffs on any trade between Kenya and the US. This is a major thing for a number of reasons that I'll mention after. But currently, I think where Kenya is coming from is that Kenya currently, because it's a developing country, is benefiting from the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, the AGOA Act that started in 2000, and it benefits developing countries in that they can export to the US and then export to them at their quotas that are allocated to them, and the tariff rates are also a bit lenient on them. And the AGOA is going to expire in 2025. So I think where Kenya is coming from, it's looking at it and thinking that the other thing to note is that Kenya exports to the US. The US is the third highest country where Kenya exports to. So think that the exports from Kenya, that of the top 3 countries that Kenya is exporting to, US is one of them. So Kenya is looking at this and thinking that once the AGOA 2025 comes, it's not renewed, we don't have like such a lenient system of trading with the US, then what happens to all the exports that Kenya is exporting to the US? And I think it's on that basis that the president of Kenya, when the discussion was put on the table, of course, took it. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe to just add on to what you say, like you say, the main reason for this free trade agreement is based on the AGOA Act, which is expected to expire in September 2025, which is basically a trade program that is meant to establish stronger commercial ties between the US and a selected number of countries within the sub-Saharan Africa. So Kenya had to look at this perspective that if the AGOA expires, right, it obviously goes away with the preferential treatment that it was receiving, mainly the exports, the apparels, the coffee, and the nuts that were being exported to the US. What then happens, so to speak? It also needed then to try and negotiate an agreement for preferential trading terms so that it continues to benefit from what it was benefiting from the AGOA and going forward. But then, if you look at how the World Trade Organization is set up, there is what they call the generalized system of preferences, which is mainly for developing countries. These are preferential terms that are given by developing countries to developed countries. But then, speaking of the AGOA, I think I read somewhere where they were actually saying that there is like an increased talk within the US to actually try and extend the AGOA, mainly because it also had so many benefits for the US citizens. So I just wanted to ask from you, Christine, that what do you think should be the better option? Should Kenya continue with the free trade agreement, or maybe try and see where the AGOA goes, given that there are talks that it actually want to be extended? What could be the better option, the AGOA or having the free trade agreement?
I think, of course, coming from a selfish perspective where Kenya is only looking at itself, because a free trade agreement, that places, it's something that is agreed between the countries. It's not at the discretion of the US, like AGOA, how long they extend it, whether they will extend it. A free trade agreement gives a bit of certainty to Kenya, in the sense that as long as the agreement is signed and there's provisions on how it can be changed, I think Kenya will feel safer if they have the free trade agreement. But I think coming from the perspective of that, especially Kenya is within the East Africa community, that Kenya is applying a common external tariff within the East Africa community, that Kenya is within this bilateral agreement with other African countries who would be benefiting from AGOA, then I would think if Kenya was looking at the long-term benefits, it might be better to wait for AGOA and see what happens.
You have raised an important issue, particularly with regards to Kenya being a member of a number of regional integration sort of frameworks, right? Because you have Kenya being part of the World Trade Organization, which is a multilateral institution to which the US is also as a member of. But you also have Kenya being a member of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the East African Community, COMESA, and the tripartite trade area between COMESA, EAC, and SADC. So now the question becomes, how is the free trade agreement, so to say, going to look, particularly in respect of the fact that Kenya belongs to a number of regional economic initiatives? How is Kenya going to balance the two? And I was actually looking at some of the issues that are maybe of importance to actually consider when negotiating this FTA, particularly the issue of regional integration. How does it fit in the broader perspective? The AfTA, the TFTA, EAC, and COMESA. And secondly, the taxes on data. I would expect you, Christine, to say something on that because you're our tax specialist. But it seems as if the US is actually pushing for lower taxes on which is something that is so different from the stance that Kenya is actually taking. And also the important issue of GMOs, right? The genetically modified organisms that the USA is known to be an innovator for. And you've got the Kenyan government taking a stance that it bans all importations of GMOs because they are against the. So how then can we say that the government of negotiate better to actually try and iron out these issues? Because these are issues that are important they're important, they need to be considered, but I don't think with the way that most African governments have been negotiating bilateral agreements and preferential agreements, they are going to be given regard to.
Yeah, and I would think like the first thing is that I think Kenya should consider what you said, the fact that it's part of these regional economic communities. It's not a small deal that Kenya is part of the EAC and using a common external tariff, which is negotiated on any imports that are coming within the EAC to apply this rate, and now Kenya to be negotiating the FTA with the US to have different tariff rates, and the US, as you're saying, is pushing for lower and lower rates that for the imports into Kenya, for its exports into Kenya. So the thing with Kenya, the other thing to mention is that it relies on a lot of revenue for the government from taxes and import duty.
Mm-hmm.
Import duty is a big source for the revenue for the government. And if you look at even like the East Africa common external tariff, there's for any exports coming from outside EAC, you find like finished goods have a much higher rate of import duty than raw materials that are coming into the country. And what the US, being a more industrialized country, would be exporting would be finished products. So at this point where Kenya is earning quite a high amount of import duty on these finished products, now the US will be negotiating for much lower or no duty on this. So Kenya is also losing revenue. And I think Kenya expects that in the long term that it's going to win. But I think this not small, but key considerations should be taken into account. And for me, I think a big issue especially is like, it's almost like Kenya is being put in a distinct position from other African countries by the US. It's being almost being segregated in the sense that Kenya is here, it's part of the EAC. In fact, the US already has a trade and investment framework with the EAC where they should be having discussions across the EAC. But here is Kenya, of the EAC countries, negotiating for a free trade area with the US. I think there is much more thought that should be put into that agreement, not just even for the money that Kenya will lose immediately in the import duties, but what it also means for the commitments that Kenya has within the EAC and these other regional communities.
Yes, I think now that you have zeroed your focus on the EAC, maybe it would be of interest to actually share with you what has been going on. Mm-hmm. So it seems as if there is a huge number of organizations within the private sector, the civil organizations and non-governmental organizations within the EAC region that wrote an open letter to the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. They were actually urging the Secretariat to consider intervening so as to convince Kenya to abandon the negotiations with US or to at least postpone the negotiations to a later stage. And from what I was understanding from the letter that was written, they were citing a number of reasons. The main being that the two countries are unequal. USA obviously is a very developed economy and Kenya is a developing economy. Mm-hmm. And they actually cited an example of California, which is a state within US, which is actually the fifth largest economy in the world, according to them. So you look at how that sort of tilts the scale when we go to the negotiation table, because we have a country that is negotiating from a position of power and another that is negotiating from a position, I would say a weaker position due to the disparities in the economies that are concerned. And they were saying that if you look at the rankings of US trading partners, you'd realize that Kenya is actually ranked as the 98th partner, which has got an export of 365 million US dollars. But when you compare the $365 million to the value of exports, you realize that the imports, they're actually twice as much the value of imports, because Kenya exports produces that are valued at 365, but they import goods from the US that are actually valued at 644 million. So the question then becomes, who stands to benefit more from the agreement? Is it Kenya or it's actually the US? And they were actually saying that the agreement could cripple the sectors such as agriculture and the manufacturing, mainly because of the GMOs that we were talking about, and also it would sort of stifle the growth of the MSMEs within Kenya. So now the question becomes, who stands to benefit more from this agreement? How then best can negotiate to make sure that they also reap considerable benefits that actually lead to deeper economic growth within the country?
I actually agree with the open letter and what you say, especially because if you look at the Kenya economy, it's made up of MSMEs. Like it's the informal sector. It's not like the big companies in Kenya. If those that are operating here, even most of them are not domestic companies. So even the US in negotiating this, it would help like the US companies to be able to easily access the Kenyan market, for instance. So the domestic industries themselves, like the very small businesses that's trying to, like build up their business in Kenya, those are not many. And they're actually the very small companies that are trying to survive in the economy. So I agree. And even like with in the agricultural sector, like the GMOs, and Kenya tries as much as possible to just have organic food products, which to be in the market. And now this is you introducing like the GMO products, and these directly affect the small scale farmers who are the majority of farmers in Kenya.
Yeah.
So that most of the food products that I would buy from the Kenyan market, it's someone who is a subsistence farmer who grew these products in their small farm, and they've taken it to the market where I'm going to buy it from them. So when you look at what that's likely to do, and it could be in anything, from buying something as simple as eggs from the farmers to it's someone just who just does very basic farming from their small farm, and they are able to access the market. So once the Kenya market is open to like a huge amount of like the US products coming into the Kenyan market, first of all, the products are likely to be much cheaper because of the US subsidies that are given to the agricultural sector in the US. So the government is subsidizing, and it's able to export to Kenya at such low prices. So of course, me being a consumer, I'm unlikely to go for the organic, more expensive foods. So clearly, there's likely to be like an unfair advantage to the US and a clear disadvantage to like the very small informal sector that's in Kenya, which is the biggest percentage of, yeah.
Christian, this sort of brings me to the point that we were trying to make in the previous discussion, that with every negotiation that takes place, be it at regional level, be it at our regional economic communities level, or multilaterally or even bilateral agreements, the ultimate responsibility for African negotiators should be to focus on the 99%, right? The 9 of all trade most African countries. And we are talking about SMEs, we are talking about women-led businesses, we are talking about youth-led businesses, because those are the businesses that get to be affected by most of these other trade agreements or terms that policymakers tend to go and negotiate. It brings me to this argument that I don't think this is just an issue that Kenya is facing, but I think there is a lot that has to be done with how African countries, like the majority of them, negotiate, trade deals and any other agreements, be it bilateral investment agreements, particularly with, because I think there is a tendency of not paying attention to matters that are actually important, that are contextual, and just getting, agreements that don't necessarily end up benefiting the 99% that are actually supposed to be benefiting. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think the thing with Kenya and this negotiating for this FTA with the US, I think, as you say, Kenya should understand really what's going on, because you should ask yourself, this is the US does not have many FTAs with Africa. Like the only other FTA they have is with Morocco. Like Kenya will be the next country that the US is approaching to negotiate for this FTA. And if you look like at what the US was doing when negotiating for the FTA with Morocco, is that first of all, Morocco is an Islamic state. Morocco is, like, you see the things that the US upholds and says these are the things we are looking for in our trading partners. Is like there's democracy, that there's the rule of law, there is, these are the things that the US says that these are the guiding principles in its negotiations. Look at Morocco. Morocco is ruled by is a monarchy. Like the king is the one who makes decisions even to appoint the prime minister. The king can fire the prime minister and dissolve the parliament. It's an Islamic state. There's no separation between state and religion. Like, in fact, the king of Morocco is the commander of the faithful, and he is said to be the descendant of Prophet Muhammad. The rule of law, democracy, and it's very different perspective from the US. And when you look at the reason why the US negotiated for the FTA with Morocco, it was done by the Bush administration. And this was around the time that there was the war with Iraq, and Morocco was supporting the US, and the US was almost trying to look for allies in the Islamic world. So it was a strategic, it wasn't an economic strategy that the US was, and of course, the US is going to benefit economically, but there's a reason behind which the US is normally approaching these countries to negotiate for FTAs. And I think Kenya would be wise, as you're saying, like to know like the 99% of the people who should be the ones benefiting. But the small benefit that Kenya seems to be looking at is when AGOA expires and it's not extended, and it might be extended, then we would be in a more comfortable position if we have the FTA. But what Kenya is not looking at is that, but what's the strategic thing that the US is trying to pursue through this? Because it's not really always about the economy. Because like with Morocco, it was like almost. I was reading an article where they were saying that the US was rewarding Morocco and sending a message to other Islamic states that if you are an ally to us, you could benefit. Like we're almost like showing them this is the carrot that anyone who dances to a tune gets. And it was in the heat of the moment when they were doing that. So Kenya should be wise enough to ask itself, let's see, we have Morocco here. It's the only other country that the US is having an FTA with. And this is the circumstances under which it was negotiated. Then Kenya asks, what really does the US want? Yeah.
You raise an important issue, particularly with the US and Morocco free trade agreement. And I think that's one of the closest examples that the Kenyan government should look at. An occasion to actually read more about the free trade agreement and the aftermath. I was trying to look at how the benefits that accrued to either parties after the entering into force of the agreement. And this is what I actually found out. The agreement entered into force in January 2006. And since it entered into force, you would realize that the US goods trade surplus rose $9 million to 1.8 billion. That's a huge margin if you look at it, because we're talking of a growth from 79 million to 1.8 billion. And it actually rose. It's actually believed it was a 45% increase in the subsequent year to 2.8 billion US. So that's a lot of money if we're looking at the GDP of most African countries. So you are right. Countries have to actually ask themselves, what does the other trading partners stand to benefit more from this free trade agreement? Is it purely for economic benefit, or there are also other reasons as to why we have been approached by country A to try and negotiate preferential trade agreements? You would realize that in 2012, discussions with Morocco around Morocco's implementation of the tariff rate to afford US wheat producers preferential access to Moroccan markets, right? So at the end of the day, it's about each country pushing its agenda first to ensure that it grows economically, it is comfortable as far as global value chains are concerned. So now I really support the argument that you have raised that these are some of the things that the Kenyan government, other African governments should look at before they try to negotiate preferential terms, particularly with developed countries, because there is always something that they stand to benefit more at the behest of African countries. And I think for some reason, the negotiators tend not to look at the behind. They don't look at behind the scenes of the negotiation forum. They tend to just accept what has been put forward, what they've been told they stand to benefit, without actually like interrogating to see the extent to which they actually benefit. I think they lack the cost benefit analysis to see how well they're benefiting. Maybe to quote the words of somebody on an article, they were saying that there is need for an economic impact assessment, right? So before country A, which is a developing country, decides to deal for preferential trade with they actually need to an economic impact assessment to see if their economy is suitable enough to actually be part of this agreement. If it's suitable, how is it benefiting? How does it tend to benefit? Is it benefiting or milked under the guise of a preferential agreement?
I think for Kenya especially, they are looking at the US is the third country where we export to. They are not looking at the quantities of the export, because we might be looking at that we export, but what are we earning from these exports? Fair enough, we're exporting to the US, but how much revenue are we earning from these exports? But even more than that, how much are we importing from the US? And then because Kenya thinks to itself that like the coffee and the tea that we export to the US, if like their AGOA expires, then we may not have like this market to export it to. But then also look at it on the other hand and look at what other potential markets could arise. Instead of like explore what other markets there could be for these products if their AGOA expires, and then look on the other hand, if we have the free trade agreement with the US, does that increase our exports? Because it doesn't mean that because you have a free trade agreement that we will increase our exports. We need something to export. So you shouldn't automatically assume that you'll get more trade if you have nothing to trade in. And so what you're trying to secure a market which you may not even be able to like export as much to once your industries are disadvantaged through opening up to this other economy. So you might be looking to so fast to have this market, but the effect of that is that even the little things that you can import to this market, at the end of the day, you lose it because of the impact that the market has on you. So I think there's much more thought on the impact of this that needs to be considered, and to always bear in mind that the US is not negotiating this thing for the benefit of Kenya. It's negotiating for the benefit of the US.
You know what? In one of the, like we have been saying since this discussion started, that one of the specific objectives of this FTA is to ensure that there is no disruption to Kenya's market access after the AGOA expires. Yes, it might be a good idea, but I mean, has anybody ever paused and tried to pose this question? What has the US been benefiting from the AGOA? Because in as much as it on paper it looks like a very good program for African countries, how has it been benefiting? Because whether it's extended or it's not, ultimately the question becomes how much did it benefit? And such benefit, can it be said the same for the sub-Saharan countries that were supposedly supposed to be benefiting from the agreement? So before we negotiate these agreements, these programs and everything, it's important to actually have an impact assessment. We look at the previous agreements that we've been party to, right? Like for now, before Kenya actually like goes further with negotiations, it needs to look at the situation that is currently within the relationship that exists between the two parties, right? We're talking of the AGOA. How much has it benefited from the AGOA? Can it be said that without this trade program, Kenya would not have probably risen as far as its economic development is concerned to that level?
Mm.
How much of the economic growth, Kenya being part of the global value chains, how much of it can be attributed to the AGOA? Up until we are willing to have these conversations, I feel like we are still going to continue negotiating agreements from which we accrue very little benefits as compared to the other counterparts that we're negotiating with.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that has been observed as to why the US has approached Kenya, or at least in particular the Trump administration has approached Kenya, is because the Trump administration was trying, the US was trying to reduce the impact that China is having, especially the inroads that China is making in Africa. And one of the arguments that has been presented is that because of the China Belt and Road Initiative, where the standard gauge railway that was constructed in Kenya was supposed to be the flagship project on the Belt and Road Initiative. It was giving a lot of legitimacy to China. And so it has been argued that what the US is trying to do, because it wants to reduce the impact that China is having and the relationship that is being created amongst African countries and China, and also the fact that the imports that Kenya is getting from China are way much more than the imports that it's getting from the US. So of course the US is seeing this development between Kenya and China, between Africa and China, and the US is trying to be strategic about its negotiations. So it's right what you're saying, that Kenya is not evaluating the relationship in the sense that what have we benefited from this period of AGOA, and it's going almost blindly into negotiating this without realizing that, and these other people are observing it, that the US is not even so much interested in the economic side, that there's a target which they are aiming at, and that's China, and neutralizing the power that China is trying to build in Africa. And Kenya was a quick target, the same way that Kenya was still a quick target by China. And until Kenya realizes that it's being targeted in these ways, and this might be a trade war between China and the US, and Kenya is caught in the middle, until you realize that I can actually be used as pawn, you will be used as pawn, you know?
You have actually made me realize something. I feel like we are actually going to a second scramble and partition for African economies. The trade war that exists between the US and China supposedly spilling over into Africa. I was reading somewhere that, how after Britain decided to exit the European Union, it obviously had to look towards negotiating trade relations, investment relations with other countries, and obviously they are looking also to Africa. And there is actually a press release that was saying that the British government has appointed a certain MP as new trade envoy to Nigeria. Part of the reason, I would assume, is that because she is a British Nigerian. She is born of a British mother and a Nigerian father. And that person has been put on the forefront for British Nigeria future negotiations as far as trade and investment is concerned. I mean, that should ring an alarm if we are trying to be very honest about this discussion. It ultimately is, you know what, this is a negotiating strategy that is already being employed before the trade negotiations actually take place. So I think we as Africa, we then also need to strategize to see that even if there is a lot of things that are happening around us, scramble and partition for Africa, as I would want to call it, the trade wars that are existing between superpowers, as they would be called, ultimately we also need to benefit something if we are also going to be used maybe as ponies in the game, or if they're going to be looking towards the continent of Africa to try and get into relations, be it in investment or in trade.
Mm. And I agree with you, like Nigeria, you think like such an obvious move, you can see this is what's happening. But I think that these are
Yes.
the things that Africa should be, I don't know, be honest about, you know? Like think, don't assume that anyone is looking out for your interest, in the sense that you think wow, like the UK now is approaching us and they have appointed someone of Nigeria, from Nigeria to do this. You should actually
Yes.
think this from the fact that like the UK has just exited from the European Union and they're looking to build these relationships. And of course, it makes sense as to this is what they will do. Like for instance, like the direct flight between Nairobi and New York was launched in 2019, and it was very much celebrated that like finally we can fly direct to like New York or to like such things. First of all, what why are we even like why is that something that we are stopping and saying this is such a big advantage we are receiving?
Yes.
We should
Yes.
stop calling things that are not advantages, or like calling the free trade area that's being negotiated with the US, because Kenya is the only country that has been identified by the US that there is an advantage to it. That's not an advantage. You should stop calling things that are not advantages, or celebrating things that are not even advantages in the real economic sense to you as advantages, because it's almost like you're flattered that we are getting attention from a superpower and therefore we must be special.
Yes.
We are not special. Like you need, and as long as you don't stop and realize that just because someone from, let's say, Ghana has been proposed by the US to sit, I don't know in what international body, that doesn't mean that the US is thinking Ghana is now an equal power with us. No, they are looking for something from Ghana,
Yes.
and they'll come. The chicks will come home to but that's the thing, that until we realize that this is almost like a strategy that's being employed, and then you stop calling things that are not benefiting you anything of benefit to you. That's when you start negotiating things that benefit you. Yeah.
Yes. Some of these things that are actually done and is empowering Africa or Africans, you'd actually, if you try to take a closer look, you see that there is actually like a motive behind. Somebody was saying that the whole idea that China comes to Africa and gives out and dishes out loans and grants and everything, it's not because they so much want to just, part with resources, but it's actually a strategy because, I mean, come on, you can't speak against a person whom you owe. Because if then they demand that you give them what you owe them and you're not in a position to do that, you are basically left with one choice: to advance and support whatever interest that they have or whatever proposal that they make. So if we are not very careful as a continent, I feel like we're just going to be thrown around. History is going to repeat itself over and over again, and we'll still remain the underdeveloped in quotes, as they would want to put it, right?
Yeah.
The other problem that I have with how negotiations are done in Africa or in most African countries, so to say, is, they are done without proper consultations. There are no public consultations that are usually done. From the perspective of an African, that I don't remember ever hearing of an instance where the public was actually like involved whenever the government was trying to get into a deal with let's say China, with the US, with the EU, or with the UK, right? You then only hear from the media that, oh, this is the agreement that was signed between our government and that government. The question becomes, if then you are doing it for the good of the people, how come the people themselves are not, they are not involved in the decision making process? Because ultimately, I think public consultations are important so that you get an appreciation of the things that actually matter for the people, right? Coming from an economic perspective and having to negotiate trade and investment agreements, I would say that when you go through public consultations and you hear views from the private sector, from the 99% that we're talking about, you get to understand the things that are very important to them, such that when you go and negotiate these terms and these agreements, you go there knowing fully well what would benefit the 99%. So you know for a fact that if the problem that you're having within your particular country has to do with infrastructure development or transfer of technology and skill, when you go to the negotiation table, you know at the back of your mind that ultimately, if it's a win-win deal, we know that whatever that happens, there is transfer of technology, there is transfer of the know-how, and there is infrastructural development within our country. And I don't think this is something that most African governments are doing. Tend to be correct, but I think that would actually be a step further to ensuring that we actually negotiate deals and terms and agreements that ultimately benefit our continent, our country, and our people.
Yeah, and I think what you say is it's so spot on, Chido, because like when you look at Kenya, our constitution, there's a requirement for public participation. There's a Treaties
Yes.
Ratification Act. The Treaties Ratification Act requires public participation before a treaty, because international treaties form the part of law of Kenya under the Constitution of Kenya. And because of that, the fact that any treaties that are negotiated by Kenya form the laws of Kenya, there's a requirement by the constitution that there's public participation. And there's a law now, a treaty should be ratified in Kenya. And one of the requirements before the treaty is actually ratified is that there should be public participation. Like recently, even something as small as a double tax treaty, Kenya went and negotiated a double tax treaty with Mauritius. Yes, it's another African country, but Kenya was standing to lose a lot of revenue. And the matter was taken to court, and the court ruled that it was unconstitutional because there was no public participation. It was the first time that we ever had someone ever say that the public should participate in treaty negotiations. In Kenya, it's a matter that it's in the constitution, what we were discussing about last week.
Yeah.
That it's not like the laws are bad. There is a law in that constitution that says bring the public to participate. It's never done. So it's just that Kenya goes, negotiates for something strange with China. And they negotiate and come, and they never even offer the information to the public. We don't even know where that agreement is. Standard gauge railway, no one knows what stamps they were there. We don't even if it's there, maybe I don't know where it is, but I don't think it's a document that's a public document that we can easily go and access and look through and interrogate and question and say, do not enter into these deals as a country. It is something that is, I think, just what you say, it could help, but it's not being used.
So the question becomes, when the policymakers and government negotiators go to the negotiation table, who are they negotiating for? On whose behalf are they actually negotiating for? Because if you don't consult the very same people that put you in power to actually do that for them as representatives, and if you don't consult the people that would then stand to benefit or be disadvantaged by whatever outcome, then I don't think you are doing what you're supposed to do. Before we even try to blame the US, EU, China, and all these other countries, we need to look within. What are we doing wrong as a continent? What is it that we need to what do we need to correct so that when we go to the negotiation table, we are going there with a united front and knowing what we actually want. When you are fully informed, you can then go and say, this does not support what we are trying to achieve as a country. This does not, benefit the people within the country. Like, for instance, I'll argue that we were talking about how most developing countries tend to benefit from revenue collection and all that. But then you then have policymakers and negotiators going to negotiate agreements that tend to lower the import taxes and customs duties that are supposed to be the huge part of revenue generation within the country. It then begs the question, how are they negotiating, and for whose benefit are they negotiating?
And especially when you say that, Chido, it's so right, because so the import duties are decreased, the government still needs revenue. The other logical thing the government will do is that it will increase the taxes that I, as an employee, bear within Kenya, or I, as the revenue that I have to pay on VAT, so that the cost of goods within the country increases. The amount of income that I get decreases because the government is taking more from employment tax. And the logic behind it is that because we have a trade deal where we did away with all import duties. Granted that increasingly the WTO is trying to reduce tariffs across the world, but we should understand where we are at as a country. And what you say is quite right, that like the Constitution of Kenya says that the power is in the people, and it's given to these legislators. Power belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to a policymaker. It doesn't belong to the negotiator who is going to negotiate for Kenya. The power of the people in Kenya belongs to the people of Kenya. We just give it to you and for you to go exercise it responsibly. That's why we have a law. That's why we are ruled by law. It's a rule of law system that we apply so that if you have any power to go negotiate, it's because the law gives you that power. And the reason why the law says it gives you that power is because the law allows us to give that power to you as a people. But it is such a disconnect. I think the minute someone becomes a policymaker or gets to parliament, it completely is a different ball game, the things that they're doing. But then also I would say even us as a people, we are not holding these leaders into account. So for instance, there's one corrupt scandal one after the other in Kenya. I mean it's not even no longer like something we sit down and speak under the table. It's out there. Like there's so much corruption that you don't even know what to do anymore. But I, as a voter in Kenya, why should I keep voting for that same politician? Like the system comes down even again down to me as a person, like the ordinary person in Kenya, who keeps empowering bad leadership. Every 5 years, you go and elect the same wrong and person who has been corrupt throughout the 5 years within that small period of time where you're giving your power to someone to go negotiate for you an international in the international market. This is the person you're giving your power to. You don't even think through it about that. So I think the problem comes very close home when you realize how much also you as a single individual person within Kenya is participating in this corrupt system. The whole system from the bottom up is like very corrupt, and we are only getting the fruit of the tree that we are. Like we just are corrupt people who do not want to even think past the leaders we are choosing, and therefore for our future. And someone will say that it's because like the common person does not understand these things. Like someone might argue and say that the person walking on the street in Nairobi does not understand like the impact they have when they're choosing their leader. But I would say no. No. You cannot say that I pick a bad leader because I don't understand what they are going to represent to me. If you're picking a bad leader today, there's no miracle that will work out within the next 5 years when they are in parliament and they're the ones ratifying a treaty. That they'll suddenly now completely now become a good leader. You pick the leader right there, knowing this is a corrupt person. You can only get corrupt deals negotiated for you.
Speaking of our political representatives having to be the ones that actually go and negotiate and do all those things, I think I do have a problem with that as an individual, mainly because a political career, anybody can decide to have a political career in any country, let's be very honest. But the question becomes, how much do they know, particularly with regards to the exact position that they've been put in place, right? Anybody can be an MP, anybody can be a minister, but the question becomes, do they really understand anything that actually pertains to international trade, investment, competition law, intellectual property rights, before they and negotiate these agreements? If it was up to me, I would have the political representatives being the people that have the overall say when it comes to, let's say, okay, fine, being the people that actually put or appendix a signature to an agreement. But I don't think they're the people that are supposed to be on the forefront of negotiations. Why can't we have experts in those areas negotiate on behalf of the country? Because at least they've got more than just surface knowledge with regards to what's actually happening. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's an excellent point. The same way, right now, the Kenya Revenue Authority is a public body, but they do not employ people who know nothing about tax to collect tax. Like they look for experts in those areas, or the judiciary. The judiciary is like an arm of the government, but it's experts who are in the judiciary. Like the judiciary, it's advocates, people who have gone through a legal training program. It's not politicians who sit in the judiciary. And yes, the parliament is made up of people who have decided to take a political career for whatever benefit, and there's no requirement maybe to a certain level of education. Maybe they should require people to have a certain level of education. But in these other arms of the government, the judiciary, there's no day that you say that I want now to be a judge. I have no legal knowledge whatsoever. but now I have a passion in my heart for leadership. No, the judiciary there's a requirement of a certain qualification that you should have. The executive, the same way, if you look at these arms of the government, like, yes, the president picks the cabinet secretaries in Kenya, for instance, but within these the state departments themselves, you require a certain level of expertise to work there. You must understand the economy, how principles of economy work. The Central Bank of Kenya to be the governor there. But the same way, I agree. I completely agree that the person who is going to negotiate this agreement should not be a politician who does not understand the World Trade Organization and the principles of international trade. But for some reason, I think African leaders especially take this as an opportunity to go visit the WTO and to tour the world and to go shop in Geneva and other places, explore the world. And that's why someone wants to go to Washington, not necessarily because they have any expertise in international trade, but because they want to go tour. So when an opportunity arises for someone to go to negotiate the deal, the person who has no qualification immediately in that state department, they're the ones who offer themselves, not necessarily because they want to go. They now use their arm twist by using their power. And they use their power in the wrong way by saying, because I'm the powerful one here, therefore I'll push my way and go to Washington. But if the intern who understands international trade was given the opportunity to even have a say in it, there might be better fruit and better product. So again, it's abuse of power. So I think what happens in these circumstances is there's just abuse of power that leads the most powerful person, the person with the loudest voice, to be the one going to negotiate these things, not necessarily because they have any knowledge, but because they can speak louder or they can push the hardest. So I think the strategy needs to change, like at the end of the day, there either needs to be principles of that are put in that treaty negotiation as act that requires certain levels of, like there should be, if a politician is unable to control their power at that point, then the law should do it,
Yes, this is a very interesting discussion, and we could go on and on and on and talk about it. But I think in the interest of time, we might as well wrap it up now. So what are your parting words to the policymaker who's listening right now, the future negotiator who's listening right now? What are your parting words? What do we have to do as a continent? What do we have to do as countries to make sure that when we go to the negotiation table with these developed economies, we go there and actually push an agenda for our people that we will be representing, or that would have to put us in those places of negotiation?
I would say, like, you need to think past the moment. You need to think past today. You need to think past this principle that says Africa lives from hand to mouth. We need to learn that we don't live for the moment. If our mindset is always be like, get the quickest deal, get the quickest cash that we can, and never think about the future, then we can only live from hand to mouth. Because the reason why we are in this position is because these are the kinds of deals that we negotiate. We will never be able to move past being the countries that live below $1, people who can't even afford the most basic things. And it's because we are negotiating deals that cannot give us the most basic things. And what I would say is that if someone is ever gets the opportunity to go negotiate for their country, know that you have a great responsibility and take it seriously. Take it seriously as if you're going to negotiate this deal, as if it was your deal and you're going to sign an employment contract for yourself, or you're going to sign an investment contract for yourself. Look at this benefit as if it was a benefit that was going to benefit you personally. And in that way, it will help you not look at Kenya as just like a mass of land that has no individual people who live there, who do not deserve to get proper representation. You need to actually think of the individual person who is walking on the street, who you're claiming to be negotiating for, and negotiate for them as if you were them. And also to equip every person who is a citizen in an African country, they need to actually also equip themselves to know what kind of leaders we need, to know what kind of changes that we need. And because this impacts on the people that you pick up as leaders and ultimately the kind of decisions and negotiations that they get into. Yeah.
That's profound. Thank you so much, Christy. And maybe to just, put it out there, it seems as if UNECA has got what they call the capacity development strategy, which is basically meant to promote policies and programs that strengthen the process of African integration by assisting member states in the development of common positions towards international negotiations, as well as enhancing the skills of African negotiators so that they get optimal deals for their countries, which basically goes to what you're saying, that when you go as a negotiator and you're representing your country, you need to keep it at the back of your mind that you are not representing a mass of land and trees and goats and whatever, but you're actually representing the interests and the needs of the people that would have trusted. You are in a position of trust. So you actually need to go and do best for your country and the people that are at home. And also maybe to just reiterate on some of the points that we had raised, that before a signature is appended to any document, there should be public consultations where the public is actually consulted and the negotiators get to understand the issues that are of paramount importance. Because what happens is what's important to Kenya might not be important to Zimbabwe. So there is need to actually do public consultations in every particular country so that the issues that are important are flagged out, and those are the issues that are put forward on the negotiation table. And also the need for the economic impact assessment to actually go on the drawing board and do a pros and cons analysis, a cost benefit analysis for whatever term that would be put forward. We really need to do more as a continent, increase our knowledge, empower negotiators, and move away from nepotism and appointing each other to positions simply for that, but actually do it for the good of our country, the good of our countries, our economies, and the people at large. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, Christine, for this wonderful discussion. We urge our listeners to engage the discussion. Let us know of your views, what you think, what policies should governments put in place to make sure that ultimately we achieve the Africa we want in terms of Agenda 2063. This was The Talk. It was Christine and Chido. Thank you.
Thank you.